The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace, as Officer Marcus Webb adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the third time that hour. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold London air but from exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. 15 years of service to the Crown had taught him discipline, but nothing had prepared him for the relentless schedule of the past 6 months. Marcus had always taken pride in his position as part of Princess Charlotte's security detail. When he first received the assignment 3 years ago, he felt honored beyond measure. The young princess was kind, well-mannered, and respectful to everyone around her. Unlike some members of the royal family who barely acknowledged their guards, Charlotte always offered a smile and a genuine good morning. But lately, things had changed, and it wasn't because of the princess herself. The protocols had intensified dramatically after several security breaches at other royal residences across Europe. What used to be a demanding job had transformed into something nearly impossible. Marcus now worked 16-hour shifts regularly, sometimes back-to-back with barely enough time to see his own children. His daughter Emily had asked him last week why he never came to her school plays anymore. The question had pierced his heart like a knife. The new security coordinator, a rigid man named Edward Thornberry, had implemented changes that pushed everyone to their limits. Thornberry was obsessed with perfection and had little patience for human limitations. He demanded that guards remain standing for entire shifts without breaks, maintain absolute silence even during 12-hour overnight watches, and respond to his radio calls within 3 seconds or face written warnings. Marcus watched as his colleague, Officer Sarah Chen, swayed slightly on her feet near the east entrance. She had been on duty for 14 hours straight, covering for another guard who had called in sick. The flu had been spreading through their unit, but Thornberry refused to bring in temporary replacements, insisting that the regular team should simply work harder to cover the gaps. The sound of footsteps echoed through the stone corridor as Thornberry himself appeared, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with military precision. His eyes scanned the hallway like a hawk searching for prey, looking for any minor infraction he could document. Marcus straightened his posture even more, if that was possible, and fixed his gaze on the wall ahead. Thornberry stopped directly in front of Marcus, so close that Marcus could smell the man's expensive cologne. Without warning, Thornberry reached out and adjusted Marcus's collar by a fraction of an inch. The gesture was unnecessary and designed solely to assert dominance. Marcus remained perfectly still, his jaw clenched. Princess Charlotte was scheduled to attend a charity event that afternoon at a children's hospital in central London. The event had been planned for months and was particularly important to the 9-year-old princess, who had personally requested to visit the pediatric cancer ward. She had been collecting toys and books for the children, carefully selecting items she thought would bring them joy. The security preparations for such events were now overwhelming. Marcus and his team had conducted 3 separate route surveys, coordinated with local police, arranged backup vehicles, and planned for 17 different emergency scenarios. Thornberry had rejected their first 2 plans, demanding additional contingencies that seemed excessive even by royal standards. As the morning progressed, Marcus felt the familiar tension building in his shoulders. His lower back ached from standing in the same position for hours. He hadn't eaten since the previous evening because leaving for a meal break would mean disappointing his teammates who were already stretched thin. The bottle of water in his pocket remained untouched because drinking while on duty was now considered unprofessional according to Thornberry's new guidelines. Officer Chen caught Marcus's eye from across the corridor. Her face was pale and dark circles shadowed her eyes. They had been friends for 7 years, had trained together, and had covered for each other countless times. Marcus could see that she was reaching her limit, just as he was reaching his. The palace suddenly filled with activity as staff members hurried through the halls preparing for the afternoon departure. Thornberry's voice crackled through the radio, demanding status reports from each position. Marcus responded with the required phrase, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. In a small sitting room on the 2nd floor, Princess Charlotte sat with her governess reviewing her schedule for the day. The young princess was excited about the hospital visit, but had noticed something troubling in recent weeks. The guards who she had come to know and respect seemed different. They looked tired and some of them seemed sad. Charlotte was young, but she was perceptive beyond her years, a trait she had inherited from her grandmother. Marcus checked his watch again. 3 more hours until the departure time. 3 more hours of standing perfectly still, monitoring every shadow, every sound, every potential threat. 3 more hours of pretending that everything was fine when his body screamed for rest and his mind begged for relief. The breaking point was approaching, though Marcus didn't know it yet. 15 years of dedication and sacrifice were about to collide with human limitations in a way that would change everything. The carefully maintained facade of unshakable royal security was developing cracks, and those cracks were about to become visible to everyone, including a 9-year-old princess who cared more about people than protocol. The afternoon arrived faster than Marcus wanted. The convoy vehicles sat waiting in the palace courtyard, their engines humming quietly as drivers performed final checks. Marcus moved through his pre-departure routine mechanically, his mind foggy from lack of sleep and proper nutrition. He had consumed nothing but black coffee for the past 18 hours, and his stomach churned with acidic discomfort. Officer Chen was assigned to the lead vehicle with Thornberry, while Marcus would travel in the primary car with Princess Charlotte and her lady-in-waiting. This was normally his favorite part of the job because Charlotte often asked interesting questions about London landmarks or shared stories about school. But today, Marcus worried that he wouldn't be able to maintain the professional composure required. As the team assembled for the final briefing, Thornberry stood before them with his tablet, his expression severe. He reviewed the route one more time, emphasizing every potential risk point with excessive detail. His lecture stretched on for 40 minutes, covering information they had already reviewed multiple times. Several guards shifted their weight from foot to foot, desperate for the briefing to end so they could at least sit during the drive. When Thornberry finally dismissed them, Marcus felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He steadied himself against the wall, hoping nobody had noticed. The last thing he needed was to appear weak in front of Thornberry, who had already written up 2 guards this month for what he called lack of stamina. Both officers had been working 70-hour weeks. Princess Charlotte emerged from the palace entrance wearing a bright blue coat and carrying a large bag filled with gifts for the hospital children. Her face lit up with genuine excitement, and she waved enthusiastically at the staff members who had gathered to see her off. Despite the heavy burden of royal duty already being placed on such young shoulders, Charlotte maintained a warmth and authenticity that endeared her to everyone she met. Marcus opened the car door and offered his hand to help her inside, following the protocol he had performed thousands of times. Charlotte looked up at him as she settled into her seat, and her smile faded slightly. Even at 9 years old, she could sense that something was wrong. Marcus forced a reassuring smile and took his position in the front passenger seat. The convoy pulled away from Kensington Palace with smooth precision. 3 vehicles moved in formation through the London streets, drawing curious glances from tourists and locals alike. The route to the hospital would take approximately 40 minutes depending on traffic conditions. Marcus monitored the radio communications between vehicles, confirming checkpoints and status updates as required. Princess Charlotte chatted happily with her lady-in-waiting about the children they would meet at the hospital. She had read stories about several patients and had selected specific gifts she thought each child would enjoy. Her compassion and thoughtfulness reminded Marcus why he had chosen this career path in the first place. Protecting people like Charlotte, who genuinely cared about others, had once felt like the most meaningful work imaginable. But now, as his vision blurred slightly and his head pounded with the beginning of a migraine, Marcus wondered how much longer he could continue. The job wasn't just demanding anymore. It had become unsustainable. He knew at least 5 colleagues who were taking anxiety medication just to cope with Thornberry's management style. 2 had submitted resignation letters last month, though they were still working their notice periods. The radio crackled with Thornberry's voice demanding an update on their position. Marcus responded with the required information, but Thornberry immediately criticized the response time, claiming it had taken 4 seconds instead of the mandated 3. Marcus bit back a response that would have ended his career. Instead, he acknowledged the feedback and promised to respond faster, even though the criticism was both petty and inaccurate. Traffic slowed as they approached central London, and the convoy adjusted speed accordingly. Marcus scanned the crowds on the sidewalks looking for any unusual behavior or potential threats. This constant vigilance, maintained over hours and days and weeks without adequate rest, had worn down his mental reserves to almost nothing. His training kept him functional, but the human being inside the uniform was struggling to survive. Princess Charlotte had gone quiet in the back seat. When Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw her looking at him with concern. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus saw something in her expression that surprised him. It wasn't just curiosity or mild concern. It was genuine worry, the kind of empathy that most adults had long ago learned to suppress. The young princess leaned forward slightly and spoke softly so only Marcus could hear. She asked if he was feeling all right, noting that he looked tired. The simple question, asked with such sincere care, nearly broke through Marcus's professional composure. He assured her that he was fine, just focused on ensuring her safety. But Charlotte wasn't convinced, and Marcus could see her processing the information with an intelligence beyond her years. The convoy turned onto the street leading to the hospital, where crowds had already gathered behind security barriers. Photographers positioned their cameras, hoping to capture the perfect shot of the young princess. Hospital staff stood at the entrance, their faces bright with anticipation. For them, this visit represented hope and joy for the children fighting terrible battles with illness. As they pulled up to the entrance, Marcus prepared himself for the next phase of the operation. The hospital visit would require at least 3 hours of constant alertness, moving through corridors, monitoring crowds, and managing unexpected situations. 3 hours of standing, watching, and maintaining perfect composure while his body begged for rest. Thornberry's voice came through the radio again, this time ordering everyone to triple-check their positions before the princess exited the vehicle. The unnecessary command added another layer of stress to an already tense situation. Marcus acknowledged the order and prepared to open Charlotte's door, but as he stepped out of the vehicle, the world tilted slightly. The pavement seemed to shift beneath his feet, and for a terrifying moment Marcus thought he might actually collapse right there in front of the cameras and crowds. He gripped the car door handle and forced his legs to steady, willing his body to obey his commands for just a few more hours. Princess Charlotte was watching him through the window, her young face creased with worry. In that moment, Marcus realized that his struggle was no longer invisible. The cracks in the system were showing, and they were about to become impossible to ignore. Marcus steadied himself and opened the car door for Princess Charlotte, extending his hand with practiced professionalism. Despite the trembling, he hoped she wouldn't notice. The young princess stepped out gracefully, clutching her bag of gifts, but she hesitated before moving toward the hospital entrance. Her eyes searched Marcus's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. The hospital director approached with a welcoming smile, ready to guide Princess Charlotte through the facility. Camera flashes erupted from the press area as Charlotte waved to the gathered crowd. She performed her royal duties naturally, smiling and acknowledging people with the poise of someone twice her age. Yet Marcus noticed that she kept glancing back at him, her concern evident despite her efforts to focus on the event. Inside the hospital, the antiseptic smell and bright fluorescent lights assaulted Marcus's senses. His headache intensified as they moved through corridors lined with colorful artwork created by young patients. The hospital director explained their route through the facility, pointing out the various wards they would visit. Marcus tracked every word, mapping exits and identifying potential security concerns, his training overriding his physical distress. Officer Chen walked ahead of the group, clearing the path and coordinating with hospital security. Marcus noticed that she was moving more slowly than usual, and once he saw her lean against a wall briefly when she thought nobody was watching. They were both running on fumes, held together by duty and stubbornness, but human bodies had limits that even the strongest dedication couldn't overcome indefinitely. Thornberry's voice continued to crackle through their earpieces, micromanaging every movement with unnecessary commentary. He questioned their positioning, criticized their response times, and demanded updates every few minutes. The constant harassment added psychological stress to their physical exhaustion. Marcus had learned to tune out most of it, but today each criticism felt like a hammer blow to his already fragile composure. Princess Charlotte visited the first ward, where children recovering from various surgeries greeted her with excitement. Despite their own pain and challenges, these young patients brightened at the sight of the royal visitor. Charlotte sat beside each bed, asking questions about their interests and hobbies, listening intently to their answers. She distributed gifts with care, making sure each child felt special and valued. Marcus stood near the doorway, maintaining his watchful position while fighting waves of dizziness. His vision periodically blurred at the edges, and he blinked repeatedly to clear it. The room felt too warm, and sweat formed on his forehead despite the hospital's air conditioning. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to alleviate the shooting pains in his lower back. One of the children, a 7-year-old boy with a bandaged head, asked Princess Charlotte if the guard by the door was feeling sick. The innocent question rang through the ward, and everyone turned to look at Marcus. He immediately straightened his posture and forced a neutral expression onto his face, but the damage was done. Even the children could see through his professional facade. Charlotte excused herself politely from the conversation and walked over to Marcus. She spoke quietly, asking again if he was all right and suggesting that perhaps he should sit down for a moment. Marcus appreciated her kindness but explained that he needed to remain at his post. The princess looked frustrated, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to address a problem that went far beyond her authority. They continued through the hospital, visiting the oncology ward where children battling cancer greeted them with brave smiles. These kids had faced challenges that most adults couldn't imagine. Yet they found joy in small moments and maintained hope despite terrifying circumstances. Charlotte spent extra time here, holding hands, reading stories, and promising to return for another visit soon. Marcus watched the princess interact with these young patients and felt a deep respect for her character. At 9 years old, she possessed more genuine compassion than many adults demonstrated in a lifetime. She didn't perform kindness for the cameras. She actually cared about these children and wanted to make their difficult journeys a little brighter. But as the visit stretched into its second hour, Marcus felt his control slipping. The room began to spin slightly, and he had to consciously focus on breathing steadily. His hands were cold despite the warm temperature, and his heart raced irregularly in his chest. The warning signs were clear to anyone with medical knowledge. Marcus was experiencing the early stages of physical collapse, his body finally rebelling against months of neglect and excessive stress. Officer Chen caught his attention from across the room and mouthed the words asking if he was okay. Marcus nodded slightly, lying through body language because admitting weakness wasn't an option. Not here, not now, not with the princess depending on him. Chen didn't look convinced, and Marcus could see her debating whether to call for backup despite knowing that such a request would trigger Thornberry's wrath. Princess Charlotte finished her interactions in the oncology ward and prepared to move to the next location. The hospital director guided them toward the physical therapy center, where children were working to regain strength and mobility after accidents or illnesses. As they walked through the corridor, Marcus felt his legs becoming increasingly unsteady beneath him. The walls seemed to narrow and expand in his peripheral vision, and the fluorescent lights overhead created strange halos that hurt to look at. Marcus recognized these symptoms from his military training. His body was shutting down, preparing to force him into unconsciousness if he didn't stop and rest immediately. But stopping wasn't an option. The princess was still in the middle of her event, surrounded by crowds and cameras. His duty required him to maintain his position until she was safely back in the vehicle. Thornberry's voice came through the earpiece again, this time with sharp criticism about the spacing between guards. He demanded that Marcus adjust his position by 2 feet to the left, a completely unnecessary and arbitrary command that served no security purpose. Marcus complied robotically, but the simple movement made his head spin violently. Princess Charlotte turned around at that exact moment and saw Marcus stumble slightly as he adjusted his position. Her eyes widened with alarm, and she stopped walking despite the hospital director's attempts to guide her forward. The young princess stood in the middle of the corridor, watching Marcus with open concern, clearly making a decision about what to do next. The professional distance that was supposed to exist between royalty and their protection officers had never felt more meaningless. Charlotte saw Marcus as a person, not just as a uniform or a function, and in that moment, as photographers continued snapping pictures and hospital staff waited patiently, the 9-year-old princess decided that protocols and procedures were less important than human welfare. She walked directly to Marcus, ignoring her lady-in-waiting's gentle attempts to redirect her attention. Charlotte stood in front of the officer who had protected her faithfully for 3 years and spoke with a clarity and authority that surprised everyone present. She announced that the guard needed to sit down immediately, and that she would not continue the visit until he received proper care. The corridor fell silent as Princess Charlotte's words echoed through the space. Hospital staff exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to respond to a royal child issuing commands about security personnel. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment even as his body swayed dangerously. He started to protest, to insist that he was fine and that the visit must continue. But Charlotte raised her small hand in a gesture that somehow commanded authority. The princess turned to the hospital director and asked politely but firmly for a chair to be brought immediately. She explained that her security officer was unwell and needed to rest, and that she would wait right there until he was comfortable. The director, caught between protocols and the direct request of a royal child, quickly instructed a nurse to bring a chair from a nearby office. Thornberry's voice exploded through the earpieces, demanding to know what was happening and why the schedule was being disrupted. Officer Chen stepped forward to respond, but Charlotte spoke first, addressing Marcus's earpiece as if she somehow knew Thornberry was listening. She stated clearly that there was a medical situation that required attention, and that the visit would resume when she decided it was appropriate, not before. The 9-year-old princess had just overruled the security coordinator, and everyone in the corridor realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A child, despite her royal status, was advocating for an employee with more conviction than most adults would dare show. The cameras that had been focused on capturing charming moments with sick children were now documenting something far more compelling. A chair arrived within seconds, and Charlotte personally guided Marcus to sit down, her small hand on his arm showing genuine concern. Marcus wanted to refuse, to maintain his professional stance, but his legs made the decision for him by nearly buckling completely. He sank into the chair with less grace than he intended, and the relief of finally sitting after so many hours of standing was almost overwhelming. Charlotte instructed the hospital staff to bring water and asked if a doctor should examine the officer. Marcus tried to wave away the fuss, insisting he just needed a moment, but the princess wouldn't be deterred. She knelt beside his chair, her fancy coat touching the hospital floor, and looked at him with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. She asked when he had last eaten or properly rested. Marcus couldn't answer honestly without revealing the unsustainable conditions under which he and his colleagues had been working. But his silence spoke volumes. Charlotte seemed to understand without words that this wasn't just about one officer feeling unwell. This was about something bigger, something systemic that had been hurting the people whose job was to protect her. Officer Chen approached cautiously and handed Marcus a bottle of water. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw his own exhaustion reflected in his colleague's face. Chen looked like she might collapse at any moment as well. The entire security team was hanging by a thread, and that thread was fraying rapidly under Thornberry's impossible demands. Thornberry himself suddenly appeared in the corridor, his face red with anger. He strode toward the scene with military precision, clearly intending to restore order and discipline. But before he could speak, Princess Charlotte stood up and turned to face him. Despite the difference in their heights, with Thornberry towering over the small child, Charlotte held her ground with remarkable composure. The princess addressed Thornberry directly, asking why her security guards looked so tired and unwell. She wanted to know when they took breaks, when they ate meals, and how many hours they worked each day. Thornberry attempted to deflect, explaining that security protocols required certain sacrifices. But Charlotte interrupted him with a simple question that cut to the heart of the matter. She asked how the guards could protect her properly if they were too exhausted to function. The logic was irrefutable, and Thornberry found himself speechless. A 9-year-old had just exposed the fundamental flaw in his management approach. By pushing the security team beyond human limits, he had actually decreased their effectiveness rather than enhancing it. The very protocols meant to ensure safety were creating dangerous vulnerabilities. Hospital staff and the lady-in-waiting watched the exchange with barely concealed amazement. Nobody had expected Princess Charlotte to confront a senior security official, especially not with such clarity and confidence. But those who knew the princess well weren't entirely surprised. Charlotte had grown up watching her parents and grandparents handle difficult situations with grace and directness. She had learned by example that authority came with responsibility, including the responsibility to speak up when something was wrong. Marcus sipped the water and felt slight improvement as hydration began to reach his system. His head still pounded and his body still screamed for rest, but the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. More importantly, Charlotte's intervention had forced the underlying problems into the open. The situation could no longer be ignored or explained away. Thornberry made one more attempt to regain control, suggesting that they could discuss personnel matters later and should continue with the scheduled visit. But Charlotte politely disagreed. She announced that she wanted to speak with her parents about the security team's working conditions before proceeding with any more events. The visit would be cut short, and she would personally ensure that changes were made. The hospital director assured Charlotte that the children would understand and that rescheduling was no problem at all. The young patients they had already visited had received wonderful attention, and everyone's primary concern should be the health and welfare of all involved. Charlotte thanked the director graciously and apologized for the disruption, showing the diplomatic skills she was already developing at such a young age. As the group prepared to return to the vehicles, Charlotte insisted that Marcus continue to rest and that Officer Chen should escort her to the car. She also requested that another guard be called to replace Marcus for the return journey. Thornberry had no choice but to comply with her wishes, though his expression showed his fury at having his authority undermined. Walking slowly back through the hospital corridors, surrounded by staff members who now viewed her with even greater respect, Princess Charlotte maintained her composure. But those close to her could see that she was troubled by what she had learned. The realization that people suffered while serving her family weighed heavily on her young shoulders. Marcus watched from his chair as the princess departed, feeling a mixture of gratitude and concern. Gratitude for her compassion and willingness to intervene, but concern about potential consequences. Thornberry was not the type of man who took public humiliation lightly. There would be repercussions, and Marcus worried about how they might affect not just himself, but his colleagues who were equally vulnerable. A hospital nurse approached Marcus with a blood pressure cuff, insisting on taking basic vitals before he left the facility. The readings confirmed what Marcus already knew. His blood pressure was dangerously high, his heart rate was irregular, and his body was showing clear signs of extreme stress and exhaustion. The nurse strongly recommended that he visit his doctor immediately and consider taking time off to recover properly. As Marcus sat in that hospital corridor, surrounded by medical equipment and concerned staff members, he realized that everything was about to change. Princess Charlotte had forced open a door that had been firmly closed, and there was no going back. The breaking point had been reached, and now the difficult process of rebuilding would have to begin. The journey back to Kensington Palace was tense and quiet. Marcus traveled in a support vehicle with 2 other guards, having been relieved of his primary duty position as Charlotte had requested. Officer Chen accompanied the princess in the main vehicle, and Marcus could only imagine the conversation happening there. Charlotte was not known for keeping her concerns to herself, especially when she believed something was unjust. Thornberry drove in silence, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. Marcus knew that expression well. It was the look of a man whose carefully constructed authority had been publicly challenged and found lacking. The security coordinator's pride had been wounded by a 9-year-old child, and that humiliation would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. When they arrived at the palace, Marcus expected to be dismissed immediately, or perhaps even summoned to a formal disciplinary meeting. Instead, something unexpected happened. Princess Charlotte went directly to her parents' private quarters, bypassing her usual routine of afternoon tea and study time. Word spread quickly through the palace staff that the princess had requested an urgent meeting with both the prince and Princess of Wales. Marcus was directed to the medical office where the palace physician examined him thoroughly. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s named Dr. Sarah Morrison, took one look at Marcus and shook her head with concern. She had been treating palace staff for over 20 years and had seen plenty of cases of work-related stress. But Marcus's condition alarmed her more than most. Dr. Morrison conducted a comprehensive examination, checking vitals, asking detailed questions about sleep patterns, nutrition, and mental health. Marcus answered honestly, too exhausted to maintain pretenses. He described the schedule changes, the extended shifts, the lack of adequate breaks, and the constant pressure from Thornberry's management style. The doctor listened without judgment, taking notes and occasionally pausing to consider the implications. After completing her examination, Dr. Morrison delivered her assessment with professional directness. Marcus was suffering from severe exhaustion, dehydration, and stress-related health complications that could lead to serious consequences if not addressed immediately. She was placing him on mandatory medical leave for 2 weeks minimum, with required follow-up appointments to assess his recovery progress. Marcus tried to object, worried about leaving his team even more short-handed. But Dr. Morrison was firm. She explained that continuing to work in his current condition would likely result in a complete collapse that could endanger not just himself, but also the people he was supposed to protect. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. By trying to do his job despite his condition, he was actually becoming a liability rather than an asset. While Marcus received medical attention, Princess Charlotte sat with her parents in their private sitting room. She recounted the day's events with impressive detail, describing not just what had happened at the hospital but also the observations she had made over recent weeks. Charlotte explained how the guards looked increasingly tired and sad, how Officer Chen had once fallen asleep standing up for just a moment before catching herself, and how Marcus had been struggling to maintain his composure. The Prince and Princess of Wales listened to their daughter with growing concern. They had been vaguely aware that security protocols had been tightened, but neither had realized the extent to which those changes were affecting the well-being of their protection staff. Charlotte's account painted a disturbing picture of systematic overwork and mismanagement. The princess made a direct request to her parents. She asked them to investigate the working conditions of the security team and to make changes that would ensure the guards were treated fairly and humanely. Charlotte argued that protecting the royal family shouldn't require destroying the lives of those who had dedicated themselves to that service. Her parents were moved by both her compassion and her clear reasoning. That evening, the Prince of Wales initiated a series of conversations with senior palace officials and security leadership. He requested detailed reports on staffing levels, shift schedules, and the policies that Edward Thornberry had implemented. As information began to flow, a troubling pattern emerged. Thornberry had been cutting corners financially by reducing staff numbers while simultaneously increasing security measures, creating an impossible situation for the remaining guards. The following morning, Marcus woke in his own bed for the first time in what felt like weeks. He had actually slept for 12 straight hours, his body finally getting the rest it desperately needed. His phone showed multiple missed calls and text messages from colleagues, all asking about his condition and sharing their own concerns about the situation. Officer Chen had sent a particularly long message describing what had happened after they returned to the palace. Charlotte had apparently spent over an hour with her parents, and then the Prince of Wales himself had requested a meeting with several senior guards to hear their perspectives directly. Chen wrote that change seemed to be coming, though nobody knew yet what form it would take. At Kensington Palace, Thornberry was called into a formal review meeting with palace administrative officials and human resources representatives. The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Thornberry's policies and management decisions were examined in detail. His explanations and justifications were documented carefully, but the officials conducting the review had already drawn their conclusions. Princess Charlotte went about her daily routine of lessons and activities, but she made a point of asking staff members about the guards' well-being. She wanted to know if Marcus was recovering, whether other guards had been given time off, and what steps were being taken to improve conditions. Her persistence ensured that the issue remained at the forefront of palace priorities. By midweek, formal announcements began to circulate through the security department. An independent audit would be conducted to assess current working conditions and staffing levels. Temporary additional guards would be brought in immediately to reduce shift burdens on the existing team. All mandatory overtime would be suspended pending the audit results, and most significantly, Edward Thornberry had been placed on administrative leave while the review was completed. The news spread through the guard units like wildfire. Officers who had been suffering in silence, convinced that nothing would ever change, suddenly felt a glimmer of hope. Some were skeptical, having seen previous reform efforts fizzle out after initial enthusiasm, but others pointed to the fact that Princess Charlotte herself had initiated this chain of events, and the royal family seemed genuinely committed to seeing it through. Marcus received a personal phone call from one of the Prince of Wales's private secretaries, thanking him for his years of dedicated service and informing him that his medical leave would be fully paid. The secretary also mentioned that Princess Charlotte had specifically asked about Marcus and wanted to know when he might feel well enough for visitors. The young princess had apparently made a get-well card and wanted to deliver it personally. As Marcus absorbed this information, sitting in his modest living room with sunlight streaming through the windows, he felt emotions he had suppressed for months finally surfacing. Relief, gratitude, exhaustion, and a strange sense of validation all mixed together. His sacrifice and that of his colleagues hadn't been invisible after all. Someone had noticed, someone had cared enough to take action, and that someone was a 9-year-old child with more courage and compassion than most adults displayed. The breaking point that Marcus had feared would end his career had, instead, become a catalyst for positive change. Princess Charlotte's intervention had done more than just help one exhausted guard. She had exposed systemic problems and set in motion reforms that would benefit everyone in the security service, and she had done it all with grace, determination, and a simple insistence that people should be treated with basic human decency. 2 weeks passed before Marcus felt strong enough to return to the palace, even just for a visit. Dr. Morrison had been monitoring his recovery closely, and she was pleased with his progress but remained cautious. The damage caused by months of extreme stress and exhaustion couldn't be reversed overnight. Marcus needed to rebuild his physical and mental health gradually, and rushing back to work would undo all the progress he had made. During his time away, Marcus reconnected with his family in ways he hadn't managed in over a year. He attended Emily's school play, finally keeping the promise he had broken so many times before. Watching his daughter perform on stage, seeing her face light up when she spotted him in the audience, reminded Marcus why proper work-life balance mattered. He had been so focused on duty that he had neglected the people who needed him most. His wife Sarah had been patient throughout the difficult months, understanding that his commitment to service sometimes required sacrifice. But even she admitted that she had been worried about him. She had watched him deteriorate physically and emotionally, becoming a shadow of the man she married. Now, seeing him smile genuinely and sleep through the night without nightmares, Sarah felt like her husband was finally coming back to her. Officer Chen kept Marcus updated on developments at the palace through regular text messages and occasional phone calls. The independent audit had begun, and investigators were interviewing every member of the security team. Chen reported that people were speaking honestly about their experiences, no longer afraid of retaliation. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically once Thornberry was placed on leave. The temporary guards who had been brought in to cover shifts were experienced professionals from other royal residences. They brought fresh perspectives and shared stories about how security operations were managed elsewhere. Many of their protocols were just as rigorous but included built-in safeguards to prevent staff burnout. Mandatory rest periods, rotation schedules, and reasonable shift limits were standard practice in their units. Princess Charlotte had indeed made a get-well card for Marcus, and it arrived by special courier to his home. The card featured hand-drawn pictures of palace guards with smiling faces and a heartfelt message written in careful cursive handwriting. Charlotte thanked Marcus for his service and told him to take all the time he needed to feel better. She also drew a picture of herself holding hands with a guard, with the words "Friends are important" written underneath. Marcus displayed the card prominently on his mantelpiece, and it became a conversation starter when friends and extended family visited. People were fascinated by the story of how a young princess had intervened to help struggling workers. The incident had been covered briefly in the media, though palace officials had kept most details private to protect the staff involved. Still, enough information had leaked to create public interest and support for better working conditions for royal protection. Officers, the audit team discovered that Thornberry's cost-cutting measures had indeed created dangerous gaps in security coverage. By overworking fewer guards rather than maintaining proper staffing levels, he had put both the royal family and the guards themselves at risk. Exhausted officers made mistakes, missed important details, and couldn't respond as effectively to potential threats. The very problems Thornberry claimed to be preventing, he was actually making more likely. Financial records showed that Thornberry had been pressured by budget constraints to reduce personnel costs, but his methods had been extreme and poorly considered. Rather than working with palace administrators to find sustainable solutions, he had simply demanded more from his existing team until they broke. The audit report would recommend not just personnel changes but also structural reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. Marcus received an invitation to return to Kensington Palace for a private meeting. The invitation came from the Prince of Wales' office and specified that this was not a work-related summons, but rather an opportunity for Marcus to visit if he felt ready. Princess Charlotte had requested his presence, wanting to personally check on his recovery and share some news about the changes being implemented. On a sunny Thursday morning, Marcus dressed in casual clothes rather than his uniform and drove to the palace. Security guards at the gate greeted him warmly, expressing their gratitude for bringing attention to problems they had all been experiencing. Word had spread that Marcus's collapse at the hospital had been the catalyst for the current reforms, and his colleagues viewed him as an unlikely hero rather than someone who had failed at his duties. He was escorted not to the formal security offices, but to a small private sitting room where Princess Charlotte waited with her lady-in-waiting. The princess stood up immediately when Marcus entered, her face breaking into a genuine smile. She thanked him for coming and asked multiple questions about his health, his family, and whether he was sleeping better. Her questions were specific and showed that she had been thinking seriously about his well-being. Charlotte then shared the news that had prompted her invitation. The audit was nearly complete and major changes were being implemented. Edward Thornberry would not be returning to his position. A new security coordinator was being appointed, someone with experience in sustainable personnel management and a proven track record of balancing safety with staff welfare. Additional guards were being hired permanently to ensure reasonable shift rotations. More importantly, Charlotte explained, new policies were being written that would apply across all royal residences. Maximum shift lengths, mandatory rest periods, regular health screenings, and access to counseling services would all become standard. The princess had been attending meetings with her parents to ensure that these changes were comprehensive and meaningful, not just superficial adjustments that would be forgotten in a few months. Marcus listened with growing amazement as this 9-year-old child described complex policy reforms and organizational restructuring. Charlotte had not only sparked change but had remained involved throughout the process, using her unique position to keep pressure on adults who might otherwise have let the momentum fade. She understood that real change required persistence and follow-through. The princess then presented Marcus with something unexpected. Working with her parents, she had established a new recognition program specifically for royal protection officers. Unlike traditional awards that focused on acts of heroism or long service, this program would honor guards who demonstrated sustained excellence while maintaining healthy work-life balance. Marcus would be among the first recipients, recognized not for breaking under pressure but for bringing attention to unsustainable conditions. Charlotte explained her reasoning with impressive clarity. She wanted to change the culture around royal service, moving away from the idea that suffering in silence was admirable. Instead, she wanted to celebrate people who maintained professional excellence, while also taking care of themselves and looking out for their colleagues. True strength, Charlotte argued, included knowing when to ask for help and advocating for necessary changes. As their conversation continued, Marcus realized he was witnessing something remarkable. Princess Charlotte was learning leadership lessons at 9 years old that many people never learned in their entire lives. She understood that authority meant responsibility, that compassion required action, and that real change often started with paying attention to the people others overlooked. Before Marcus left, Charlotte made one final request. She asked if he would be willing, once he returned to full duty, to help train new security officers. She wanted someone who understood both the importance of the job and the importance of sustainable practices to influence the next generation of royal protection officers. Marcus agreed immediately, honored by her trust and excited about the possibility of shaping a healthier future for his profession. Walking out of the palace that afternoon, Marcus felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The breaking point that had nearly destroyed his career had instead opened doors to meaningful reform. And it had all happened because a young princess chose compassion over protocol, people over procedures, and had the courage to speak up when she saw something wrong. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same palace courtyard where his ordeal had begun, but everything felt different. He wore his uniform with renewed pride, his posture straight not from exhaustion-fueled desperation but from genuine strength and well-being. The morning sun cast the same long shadows, But now those shadows seemed less ominous and more simply part of the natural rhythm of the day. The changes that Princess Charlotte had set in motion had transformed the entire security operation. The new coordinator, a woman named Margaret Foster, had 30 years of experience in protective services and a reputation for excellence balanced with humanity. Within her first week, she had implemented rotating schedules that ensured no guard worked more than 10 hours in a single shift or more than 5 consecutive days without rest. Officer Chen stood nearby, and Marcus noticed how different she looked compared to 6 months ago. The dark circles under her eyes had vanished, replaced by a healthy glow. She had told Marcus just last week that she felt like herself again, able to focus properly and actually enjoy the work that had once brought her satisfaction. Several other guards had shared similar stories of recovery and renewed enthusiasm for their roles. The Palace Medical Office now conducted regular health screenings for all security personnel, catching problems early before they became crises. Dr. Morrison had expanded her services to include mental health support, partnering with counselors who specialized in high-stress professions. Guards were encouraged to use these services proactively, rather than waiting until they reached breaking points. Marcus had returned to active duty after 6 weeks of recovery, gradually rebuilding his stamina under Dr. Morrison's careful supervision. But his role had expanded beyond just protection work. As Princess Charlotte had requested, he now spent part of his time training new recruits, teaching them not just security procedures but also the importance of self-care, communication, and looking out for colleagues. His classes had become popular because he spoke from authentic experience, rather than theoretical knowledge. The GUI recognition program that Charlotte had established had become an important part of security culture. Every quarter, guards were honored not just for dramatic interventions or long service, but for consistent professionalism, collaborative teamwork, and maintaining healthy work practices. The award ceremony was attended by members of the royal family, sending a clear message about what qualities were truly valued. Edward Thornberry had resigned rather than face formal disciplinary proceedings. The audit had revealed not just poor management decisions, but also deliberate disregard for staff welfare guidelines. His departure had been met with relief throughout the security departments. Some people who had worked under him for years admitted they had forgotten what reasonable leadership looked like until Margaret Foster showed them a different approach. Princess Charlotte continued her charity work and royal duties with the same warmth and dedication she had always shown. But those who worked closely with her noticed a deeper awareness in how she interacted with staff members. She made a point of learning names, asking about families, and checking in on people's well-being. The lessons she had learned about leadership and responsibility at age 9 were shaping the kind of royal she would become. The young princess had also maintained her interest in the hospital, where the breaking point had occurred. She had returned for a proper visit, spending hours with the young patients and delivering even more gifts than she had originally planned. The children remembered her kindness and her willingness to stand up for someone who needed help. Their parents had written letters to the palace, expressing gratitude not just for the visit, but for the example Charlotte had set for their own children. Marcus had been invited to accompany Charlotte on several subsequent public appearances. Their relationship had evolved into something unique within the usually rigid structure of royal service. They maintained appropriate professional boundaries, but there was also genuine mutual respect and even friendship. Charlotte trusted Marcus not just to protect her physical safety, but also to give honest feedback and perspective when she asked for it. On this particular morning, Charlotte was preparing for a speech she would give at a youth leadership conference. At 10 years old, she was already being asked to speak publicly about service and responsibility. Marcus had been asked to review the speech from a security perspective, but he had also offered suggestions about content, drawing from his own experiences about the importance of treating people with dignity. As the convoy prepared to depart, Marcus noticed how relaxed everyone seemed compared to 6 months ago. Guards chatted quietly with each other, smiled genuinely, and performed their duties with focused attention rather than desperate survival instinct. The quality of security had actually improved now that people were properly rested and supported. Potential threats were identified more quickly, communication was clearer, and teamwork functioned smoothly. Margaret Foster approached Marcus with a clipboard, reviewing final details for the day's schedule. She asked about his well-being in a way that invited honest response rather than perfunctory assurance. Marcus appreciated her management style and told her so. Foster smiled and shared that she had learned long ago that taking care of people wasn't just ethically right, it was also strategically smart. Healthy, happy staff performed better in every measurable way. Princess Charlotte emerged from the palace entrance carrying a small folder containing her speech notes. She waved at the assembled guards and staff, then walked directly to Marcus. She wanted to thank him again for his input on her speech, and to tell him she had added a section about listening to people at all levels of an organization. Charlotte believed strongly that good ideas and important warnings could come from anyone, regardless of their position or rank. The young princess also shared something more personal. She told Marcus that helping him and the other guards had taught her one of the most important lessons of her life. She learned that having privilege and position meant nothing if you didn't use them to help others. Charlotte said she thought about that lesson almost every day and tried to apply it to everything she did. As they drove toward the conference venue, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey of the past 6 months. He had gone from the lowest point of his career to a place of renewed purpose and satisfaction. His family was happier, his health was restored, and his work felt meaningful again. The breaking point that had terrified him had actually become a breakthrough that changed everything for the better. The conference went smoothly, and Princess Charlotte delivered her speech with poise and sincerity. She spoke about responsibility, compassion, and the courage to speak up when something isn't right. The audience of young people and their teachers listened intently, inspired by this royal child who clearly practiced what she preached. During the question period after her speech, a teenager asked Charlotte what had taught her the most about leadership. The princess paused thoughtfully before answering. She explained that the most important lesson came from watching someone she admired struggle under impossible conditions and realizing that staying silent would make her complicit in their suffering. Real leadership, Charlotte said, meant caring about people's well-being more than maintaining comfortable appearances. Marcus watched from his position near the stage exit, moved by Charlotte's words and grateful for the chain of events that had led to this moment. He thought about all the guards whose lives had improved because one child had the courage to say that something was wrong. He thought about his daughter Emily, who now had a father present in her life again. He thought about the future recruits he would train, passing on lessons about sustainable service and mutual support. As the event concluded and they prepared to return to the palace, Charlotte thanked everyone involved in making the day successful. She made a point of thanking the security team specifically, acknowledging their professionalism and care. The gesture took only a moment but meant everything to the people who heard it. Being seen, valued, and appreciated transformed the nature of service from burden to privilege. The convoy returned to Kensington Palace as afternoon light painted the historic buildings in warm tones. Marcus completed his shift feeling satisfied and energized rather than depleted and desperate. He would go home to his family, enjoy dinner together, and sleep soundly in his own bed. Tomorrow he would return to work, ready to give his best because he had the support and resources necessary to sustain excellence. Princess Charlotte's intervention at the children's hospital had rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted. One moment of compassion had transformed an entire system, proved that speaking up could create real change, and demonstrated that true leadership had nothing to do with age and everything to do with character. The breaking point had become a turning point, and everyone involved emerged stronger, healthier, and more committed to serving with both excellence and humanity.